Welcome back to The Urban Organism. I'm Dr. George Wilkinson. In this video, I'm going to be resuming a discussion of Detroit and decay. In a previous video, I shared some maps and satellite photographs of Detroit and pointed out that it is the most lopsided urban sprawl on Earth in terms of being the largest example of an urban sprawl that has a huge half and then another half that's missing. And I associated this with the international border between Michigan and Ontario, or the United States and Canada. In this video, I'm going to be picking up on that vein of thought. So I'm going to share my screen and share a map. Now, actually, this is where I am. This is Karratha in Western Australia, where I'm based in the remote outback of Australia. And we're going to fly over to Michigan. So here's Michigan, here's Detroit. And just to reiterate the point I just made, Michigan is the largest example of a lopsided urban sprawl that you're going to find on Earth. You can see it here where the white represents urban development. And you can see on the Michigan side of this black line, by the way, is the US-Canada border. Michigan is enormous. If you've ever haven't been, or sorry, Detroit is enormous. If you haven't been to Detroit, it's a really cool city, actually. I liken it to sort of empty Los Angeles because it's actually enormous. It's got huge highways. It's sort of a homage to the automobile. And it's a really cool city. It's got a lot of really interesting culture, and the decay has given it an interesting edge. But anyway, it's a huge urban sprawl, very impressive in its size. It appeared very quickly in its development. It was number 4 in the country at its peak. And oddly enough, though, its sister city, Windsor, Ontario, is a fraction of the size. And so the point I was making in the last video is if you were to view cities or urban sprawls with a biological lens or a biological interpretation of urbanization, you wouldn't be surprised that in a competitive global economy where cities are competing with one another, that this city is failing to compete because it's missing half of itself. It has a very exceptional morphology and is an exceptional function, which is poor. It's struggling to keep up, and it's exceptional within the Rust Belt, even in the sort of scale and longevity of its decay. Well, another interesting fact is on the other touch point that Ontario has with the United States, you'll find another very lopsided urban sprawl. This is the second largest example, or Buffalo is the second largest example of a lopsided urban sprawl. Its sister city, Fort Erie, is arguably hardly exists, and Buffalo's downtown is pretty much right up against or central Buffalo is right up against the Canada border, similar to Detroit. Now, what's going on then, you have to wonder with Ontario. Ontario has 2 cities, Windsor with Detroit and Fort Erie with Buffalo, that are juxtaposed with relatively large economic opportunities, and yet it hasn't developed those opportunities. Those cities haven't grown the same. Now, you could say, hey, George, they're different countries, but that also lends support to the institutional economics, which suggests that the rules of the game really dictate economic outputs. It's not enough to have economic opportunity. Also, institutions enable or disable the ability of that opportunity to be capitalized upon. So why would Ontario be dealing with these economic opportunities differently? And the reason may be because Ontario exhibits urban primacy. Now, urban primacy is a phenomenon where one city in an economy or a territory, in this case a province, one city dominates the urban system. And that city almost always is the political capital. So in Ontario, that city is Toronto or Greater Toronto, which includes cities such as Hamilton, Mississauga, Oshawa, Oakville, Brampton. That's all part of Greater Toronto. And that is a big primate or a primate city. Now, with urban primacy and being the capital, what you find is one city's growing and other regions are not, and the largest city is multiple times larger than others. And what some scholars have suggested of primate urban systems is they suppress second cities, that there should be other cities in the urban system that would balance out the urban system, but because the primate city is sort of a winner-take-all type winner, that those cities are not growing. And Ontario lends support to that in that, okay, you could argue that Windsor should be bigger. So there's a suppressed or missing city. And Fort Erie should be larger. So there's a suppressed or missing city. So my argument here is if you want to do something about the decay of Detroit, the decay of Buffalo, and even the decay of Cleveland, which is also still struggling in that with its Rust Belt, with the Rust Belt phenomenon, you might need to look at what's going on with Ontario, what's going on with the seafare routes that run through Ontario. Is it rendering exports from Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo non-competitive? Um, and generally, primate cities really only build themselves. They will exploit their regions to feed the capital. And if you were to go to Detroit and cross over into Windsor, which I've done several times, you'll find that the economy there is full of sort of discount chemists or pharmacists, casinos, chain stores or discount consumer goods, basically places where Americans could go in and save a little money. The problem is that if you are an American and you're earning your money in Detroit and then going into Canada to spend it, or you're an American earning your money in Buffalo and you're going into Canada to spend those funds, um, those monies are never going to systematically return to Buffalo or to Detroit because there's no shared tax authority. There's no shared tier of government between those two places. So once those funds leave, obviously Canada is not spending it here. They're spending it in the what is known as the Golden Horseshoe in reference to the west coast of Lake Ontario. And a final thought I'll leave you with when we take this sort of biological perspective of cities. The Rust Belt is a region that covers what I'm tracing out here. Generally, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, arguably parts of New Jersey, parts and New York for sure. The Rust Belt covers this region. It's all in sort of what I've sort of isolated here in the map. And generally, cities in the US that used to be associated with the Rust Belt have left the Rust Belt because they pivoted. Philadelphia, New York, even Baltimore, Buffalo, Boston had very large manufacturing bases. And these cities, they still have issues. I'm not saying that they don't, but they pivoted into education, into healthcare, into other industries that have helped to buttress and improve their economies. Pittsburgh's a more recent example of a city that's pivoted into tertiary education, into other service sectors. It's not out of manufacturing completely, but they found other ways to get out of it. And other areas of the Rust Belt have had mixed success there. But what's interesting is in the middle of the Rust Belt, Ontario dips into the middle of it, literally. You have what is referred to as Canada's Golden Horseshoe, which is the most prosperous economic region of Canada. As a matter of fact, when the Rust Belt kicked off in the 40s, 50s, um, that's actually the moment in time when there was a great disruption in the Canadian urban hierarchy. Prior to that time, Montreal had been the alpha dog in the Canadian urban hierarchy. And since the Rust Belt began, the Canadian Golden Horseshoe kicked off, and Toronto not only ascended but disrupted Montreal's number one place. And Toronto is number one by a significant margin now. It's much larger than Montreal. So, an interesting juxtaposition that you have decay of some of America's former largest cities, its most productive economic region, which has been dealing with decay for generations now. And meanwhile, in Ontario, which is right in the middle of all of this, you have incredible affluence and Canada's economic powerhouse. So again, I would suggest that if you want to understand the Rust Belt, you've got to look internationally. And I think Americans need to, and I'm an American, by the way, so I'm saying this as someone who's originally from New Jersey. You've got to take this sort of superiority complex off and look overseas and look at Canada as a competitive neighbor who's not necessarily working to your best interests. Some friends can be rivals, right? We talk about frenemies. I would suggest that Canada is technically a frenemy. If you look at these economic outputs, the cities that Canada is building next to our big cities look more like parasites than sister cities. So I'll leave it there. That's sort of what I wanted to say about this as part two. Probably won't be the last time I talk about Detroit. I think I plugged it once, but this isn't my first take at this video. So if I'm saying it again, I just want to make sure it comes through. Detroit is an awesome city. If you've never been there, and you're a very proud American, it's a great city to go to. It's very preserved because it has had decay. So it's sort of like stepping back into the 60s and 70s in some ways. It's a huge city. If you like driving, if you like cars, it'll really hit those buttons for you. And it will dispel a lot of proud delusion that you might have. It sort of dispels the patriot's delusion. And it will show you a side of our culture that I think if you're really a true patriot, you should examine how we've sort of we casually discard these great cities rather than try to problem solve and save them. And so I'm really interested in saving some of these cities. I think Detroit is worth it. I think the untapped half of Detroit in Canada is worth a birthing. I think the untapped half of Buffalo is worth birthing. I think that would actually save these cities. So really, you want to solve the Rust Belt, you've got to undo urban primacy in Toronto. And in future videos, we could talk about how you might do that. But for now, I'm going to thank you for your time and attention and see you next time on The Urban Organism.